Hello and welcome to the Supernatural Fandom Track here at Continual. Today, we've got the authors of Supernatural Out of the Box and more stuff. So I'm going to let our guest authors introduce themselves, and then we'll get right into the conversation. Lisa and Dominick?
Hi, I'm Lisa Macklem, and Dominick Grace is my co-editor on 2 books on Supernatural that just recently came out from McFarland, Supernatural Politics and Supernatural Out of the Box. I'm actually a PhD candidate in law. That's kind of my mainstream gig. But I've been interested in, I also have an MA in media. My area of law is actually intellectual property, and I also have an LLM master's in law in entertainment and media law. So it kind of, there's lots of crossing of the streams there. So longtime Supernatural fan, started watching it, the first season. Really captivated, of course, by the storylines and the writing, mainly in the first 5 years. I'll be right up front with that. But it was a project that Dom and I thought it would be nice for us to work on. Full disclosure, we're married, so it was a nice thing
to each other.
Yeah, yes, that's a good point. It was a nice thing for us to do together. And we were both really interested in the meta aspects in particular of the show, and we put out a call for papers, and it just so happened we got so many great responses that we had 2 books to put together. So that's kind of me in a nutshell.
And Dominick?
Yeah, I'm a professor of English at Brescia University College, and I've always sort of described myself as theoretically a medievalist because that's what I actually did my dissertation on, but it's becoming more and more theoretical as time goes by, as I get more into doing pop culture kinds of things like this. Most of my work tends to be on things like science fiction and comic books, but as Lisa said, we watched Supernatural for years. Lisa did a lot of work on Supernatural herself, published on it before, and eventually we just sort of looked at each other and said, why don't we do a book? Not write one, but edit one, get a bunch of voices out there. And as Lisa said, it worked out really well. We got so many calls for paper, so many responses to the call for papers that we talked to the publisher and said, we'd like to actually split this across 2 books. They were great with that. And so now we got 2 for the price of 1.
That's fantastic. I love that. That's great backstory. And of course, I'm Gail Z. Martin and Morgan Bryce. As Gail, I write epic fantasy, urban fantasy, near future, post-apocalyptic, and more. As Morgan Bryce, I write urban fantasy, male paranormal romance, and I've been a huge Supernatural fan for a number of years. Contributed an article to There'll Be Peace When You Are Done, and I run a big fan group on Facebook, as well as running the fandom track here at Continual. So I think we've got a gathering of the Supernatural fans here, and I'm really excited to dive into this. When fans talk about meta, they are usually talking about episodes like The French Mistake or fan fiction or The Real Ghostbusters, where we've got things like Sam and Dean playing Jared and Jensen playing Sam and Dean. And it breaks that 4th wall, and there is a wink, wink, nod, nod, self-referentialism. You're coming at this from a more scholarly aspect. What are the nuances in how you're approaching the meta side of this? What do you mean in the book when you're talking meta?
We mean essentially the same thing, but that self-referential thread that runs through not just the show sort of referencing itself, but also the writing referencing writing, that aspect of it. My sort of dual interests of the industry and fandom sort of combine there as well, when they're looking, specifically at the industry as well. So do you want to jump in?
Yeah, there are a couple of things that I find interesting about it with Supernatural. I think part of this is a result of it having a 15-year run, and they were, sort of looking for more and more things to do. But one of the things that I find interesting for the show is that it very frequently it's about horror as well as being horror.
Mhm.
So that's meta as well, not in the sort of really obvious, we're like, breaking through the fourth wall, but you're asked to think about the conventions of the genre in relationship to how the show is approaching them in many episodes. Sometimes I think in ways that are more obviously meta, like obviously The French Mistake, or I can never remember the title of it, but the episode with the teddy bear that comes to life.
Mhm.
Wishful thinking.
Wishful thinking, yeah, those are really obvious, but or Monster Movie.
Mhm.
Those are really obvious ones where it's very much upfront that this is about the conventions. This is about our expectations of horror. But I think it's there in a lot of other contexts as well. I mean, Yellow Fever, for instance, you wouldn't think of, I think, off the top of, right away as meta, but it's very much an episode that depends for its effect on playing A, with our expectations about how Sam and Dean function as characters, but also B, playing on our expectations about the nature of horror as a genre and how we expect protagonists to respond to it and what we expect the monster to be. And that really becomes that's interesting, I think. Not that the other stuff isn't interesting, but it's interesting that Supernatural it's very self-aware in obvious ways, but it's also very self-aware in subtle ways.
I mean,
Yeah, go ahead.
sorry, I was just going to add, I mean, I think that the reason, we have so much meta in Supernatural is because the fandom was able to keep up and, really enjoy that interplay back and forth. And I mean, I think that meta aspect is very much an aspect of fandom that has certainly grown, I think, in Supernatural, but I think in general, I think fans, expect that sort of back and forth play a little bit more now.
Yeah, Supernatural came about at a time when social media was coming of age to enable that sort of back and forth and kind of making that parasocial relationship much more two-way than it had ever been able to be in the past. And we see that throughout the show as the show reacts, the fans reacting to the show, which has its own vibe going. The show certainly does play with archetypes and with what is the concept, what is a monster, who is a monster, what makes a monster. That's such an underlying thread in the show. Anything to say about that as we start off looking at some of these deeper threads?
Well, I mean, I've always found that was a really interesting thread all the way through. That it starts out as being very black and white, and I mean, I think that's something that was definitely really pushed by the 15-year run. I mean, you kind of have to move beyond sort of the black and white, basic storylines in order to keep going. So that really digging down into what actually is monstrous. I found that was a really interesting thread that ran all the way through.
Yeah, and I think that it became even more important as the show went on. Even early on, even we began to get questions about it. The Lenore vampire episode, for instance. But when ultimately, and there are different points of view we might have on this, when ultimately God becomes the villain, you can't get much more overt than raising that kind of subversion of people's expectations of binary good and evil. So yeah, that was always many of the most interesting episodes. I think are ones that don't just have a monster of the week, let's kill the bad thing episode. They're the ones that really ask questions about what do we assume is monstrous? Why do we assume that? And how do we not be it ourselves? I mean, some of my favorite episodes are the ones where there isn't a supernatural element at all, like the Benders episode, for instance, which really brings home the fact that to a large extent, it's projecting very human things.
Yeah, there's nothing supernatural there at all, and yet they're evil.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that there again, it really sort of bends back upon itself. I mean, if you talk to any actor who's playing a villain, they will tell you, well, he's not evil. He just has different priorities, right? And I think that's key, right?
Yeah.
Nobody's the villain of their own story. Everybody's the hero of their own story. But from the outside, that's not necessarily how we view it.
Mm-hmm. So we also see in Supernatural, very, very few shows reference their own writers. In this case, Carver Edlund with the Winchester Gospels, the books about the boys. And of course, whether or not they originally intended Chuck to be more than a prophet and to actually be God when they wrote that first initial episode he shows up in, who knows? But we do have the writer as God. We also get the play with the ghost hunter, the ghost facers, of seeing paranormal investigators who are looking down their noses at Sam and Dean for what they do. And we're in on the joke. Can you talk a little bit about both those elements, please?
Well, I think those are all sort of fascinating things about the show. I actually, in the second book, we have an article that we wrote together, one of the chapters, and I look specifically at that and ghost facers in that particular chapter. And I think that they really provide, again, it's a very meta thing, right? It's a very interesting commentary on, just exactly, what Sam and Dean do. It's also a critique of, reality television. I mean, that Ghost Facers episode was the first one back after the writer's strike, and, was very much pointed, this is what reality TV is. And it's, it's not really real and it's not good. So I really love that aspect of it. But, even the Ghost Facers, who started out, just being sort of a one-off funny thing in Hell House, the Hellhound website and so on. I mean, they really grew to be very nuanced. By the time we get to see them in Thin Man, it's a completely different thing, and it's so much more serious. So I think that's one of the other things that really is fascinating about it, is that, they were able to bring a lot of those threads forward and really develop them in interesting ways. And I think that, Chuck, again, is a very interesting way. And I agree. I mean, I don't think there's very many shows on television that poke fun at themselves so much. And I mean, it's not, as you know, it's not just the writers that make their way in, right? We have Margie Kugel Beer, right? There's all sorts of references.
Bobby Singer.
Yeah, Bobby Singer, right? There's all sorts of references to the crew and the cast, and, making it, it's a family behind the camera. It's a family, in the show, and it's a family, in the fandom. And there's a good reason why it's called the SPN family, right? So yeah, no, I think that those elements where they just sort of really dig down and take a look at themselves, I think, as far as the writer aspect goes, I think Dom and I both think that maybe Metatron is even more interesting than Chuck from that standpoint. So that was another way that they went off with it. That was really interesting.
Yeah, I found that really fascinating, was the episodes especially that really asked serious questions about, why are we telling these stories? What do these stories mean? It's like, the Barnes and Damien conversation with Dean, for instance, is great, because it draws the line between what it's like if you actually live this, as opposed to if you consume it vicariously as an audience member. Because from any objective point of view, Dean's right. Their lives do suck. They're terrible, horrible lives that are almost certainly going to end miserably. And indeed, in Dean's case, spoiler alert.
Yeah. It's been long enough.
But that's one of the interesting things about horror, especially as a genre. And it's one of the questions that horror makers have often asked, what are we doing here? I mean, is this exploitative? Is there a problem with us presenting pain and trauma and violence and misery and despair as entertainment? Supernatural isn't the first to do it. David Cronenberg does it really interestingly in Videodrome, for instance, but they did it very extensively. And I think in a way that, in part, because if you serialize it over years, you can keep dipping back in and saying things about it. And, maybe sometimes you say it better than others. And I think that, the fan response to some episodes certainly speaks to that. But there's a lot, part of it is that because they've done it so many times, there's a lot of nuance and a lot of things you can come back to and tease out real complexities that you wouldn't get the opportunity to do if it was just a one-off thing.
Okay. One of the other very meta episodes that always comes up when the conversation turns this way is Changing Channels, where we see
one of my favorite episodes. Yeah.
Which WandaVision totally ripped off. Am I wrong?
Yeah. which also requires not only knowing Supernatural, but having a broad enough pop culture point of reference that you're getting the jokes, and the writers just assume that you've seen all these shows and they don't have to explain it, and you get the joke, which is a lot of trust between the writers and the audience.
Yeah, one of the things I really liked about that episode too is the way it turns on a dime, and we go very quickly from Dean dying over and over and over again in hilarious ways.
No, you're on the wrong one.
Am I on the wrong one?
Changing Channels is where they spoof the other shows like Grey's Anatomy and.
Oh, right. I'm thinking of Mystery Spot. Yeah. Sorry. Never mind.
That's okay. We can come back to Mystery Spot.
Same bad. Same big bad.
But yeah, Changing Channels is a lot of fun. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it does also change on a dime, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that the thing I love the best about that is when we suddenly find out that Loki is Gabriel, right? I mean, that whole, when they have him in the circle and he's just lambasting them about, that is like one of my favorite scenes in the entire run of the show, I think. I just love that episode.
Well, there's a certain level of trust and respect that has to be there between the writers and the audience for the writers to believe that they've got an audience that is in large part smart enough to get the jokes. If you've ever been to a Dragon Con or a Comic Con and you're walking around going, there is an assumed body of shared cultural knowledge here to get the jokes, to get the costumes that are a play on 2 or 3 different fandoms at the same time. They're expecting you to have a great deal of shared cultural knowledge in your head. And the writers in Supernatural really do the same thing and bring it off.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's, I think that works on so many levels in the show too, which is so cool, right? So, like for the really dedicated fans, right? We're like, oh, look, Margie Google Bear. That's just the first one that comes to my mind. But there's just so many of those little tiny references, right? Which they're throwaways, but it's just kind of like, we see you, right? Mm-hmm. And then, and then some of the other episodes can work on, I mean, they do assume an educated popular culture audience, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you don't necessarily have to be like a dedicated fan to get those references. So, I mean, I think that the opportunities of the different levels of engagement are one of the things that are really great about the show. Yeah,
and the way that they bring it into the show itself too, and things like the different fandoms that we see the characters.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the other nuance that I really love, and that's something else that I definitely like to be looking more at.
The number of references to Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and comics, so many things. Pardon?
Game of Thrones, and Dean being a fan of classic rock and Sam being a fan of serial killers. I mean, it's awesome.
Even Dean being a fan of wrestling. I mean, that was not the best episode ever, but it was really interesting to bring in alternative kinds of pop culture fandoms that people can geek out about. It doesn't have to be just TV or music, mm-hmm. what you tend to think about, right?
Well, and I mean, things that you can, that's one of the great things as well with the childhood. I mean, hopefully not a lot of us can really identify with having been abandoned by our parents in skivvy motels, but, enjoying, wrestling or hockey or whatever it happens to be with your dad. I mean, that's something that's, pretty universal, and the joy of, your dad taking you to this event, right? Although I think did he manage to do it? I can't remember now. I have to go back and watch the episode again. Not one of my favorites. Sorry. Fouling now.
Well, let's move on to Chuck, God, the darkness. There's a lot of commentary on religion throughout Supernatural. And, we start with things like Houses of the Holy, where they think it's God and it really turns out to be a ghost, and all the way up to let's kill God in the season, the last season. Talk a little bit about the metatextuality of all of that.
Well, I'll be completely upfront and say that the basic tanking of Chuck's character was not my favorite turn in the show. I mean, I loved Houses of the Holy. I thought that was a great episode, and I'm blanking now. Go ahead.
Yeah,
I know what I was going to say. Sorry. I was going to say I mean, as often happens in a house, right? I was kind of the big fan right from the get-go. Like, I think the first episode we actually saw was Bloody Mary, and I was actually interested in the show because I was a big fan of Kim Manners from
that was the first one
X-Files.
that we saw.
Yeah, and we watched and we're like, oh, this is awesome. And then the rest is history, as they say. And Dom was, he's indulgent. He's like, oh yeah, okay, he's serious, Linda, I don't watch it.
Yeah, Lisa was, this is awesome. It's horror. I like it. I can watch it.
It's okay, right? It's sometimes scary. And then we got to the first episode of season 4.
Yep.
And as soon as Castiel made his entrance,
literally the moment I turned to Lisa, Cass says to Dean, I am the one who gripped you tight and raised you from perdition, which is almost poetry. I turned to Lisa, and after 4 years, and I said, okay, this is a great show. Because that, to me, just the line itself, but bringing in, having the nerve, it's easy to bring in demons and devils. No one has any problem with that. But bringing in angels and God, that's risky.
And then making the angels dicks.
Yeah, that's asking for trouble. I really like
one of the all-time best entrances with the lights and the sparks and the wings. Yeah, they did it up right.
Yeah,
I really liked it. And the idea of God being the villain is good. Again, it's not something that hasn't been done before. Ramsey Campbell's novel Ancient Images, I think, does it. And I love that. I love that novel. I mean, Alan Moore's Whatever Happened to the Man of Steel is a kind of a version of that, where Mr. Mixopuddle turns out suddenly to be like a maniac because he's been tired of just being, a trickster for a while. I can't say I agree with Lisa. I can't say that I thought they sold it, Chuck turning into evil, but the idea of a God who is basically a figure who is treating people as puppets and manipulating them for his own entertainment, it's a good idea. And certainly I thought in its earlier manifestations in the show, like when we first meet Chuck and he's like, oh my God, I've been putting you through all this. What kind of God am I? That raised the question. Interestingly, I was never sold on the final season where Chuck suddenly, I kept on waiting for us to discover that it wasn't really Chuck, because it seemed to me like a retcon from the Chuck that we'd had. And again, I think that might be a function of we have 15 years. Wouldn't this be a cool idea, as opposed to this is something we've actually been building towards from the beginning with this. So from my point of view, it was conceptually really interesting, but I ultimately didn't find that a satisfactory final big bad.
I mean, I think now having some distance from it has helped.
Yeah.
I mean, I also, full disclosure, I'm like completely not religious. Like, ask me a religious question from any religion you like, and I will not be able to answer it. I'm equally ignorant. That doesn't mean I don't respect them, to be clear as well. I absolutely do. And I have, if you find solace and comfort and meaning in it, more power to you. Absolutely. But I'm just explaining sort of where I'm coming from. So I wasn't invested in Chuck as God from that standpoint. More from the character as he was originally seen. But from a standpoint of a little bit of different distance, I mean, I think it's really interesting if you think of it as death of the author, right? And I think that, I mean, that worked great when he died, when Kripke left, because he was basically killing off himself and leaving, right? And if you look at the sort of it from the same standpoint in the final episode, if the author is dead, if you go back to, that lit crit thing, that basically means anybody is the author. So it's almost a handing off to the fans. Like, okay, we're done, we're out, it's yours now. And I think that, I mean, that, the whole fact that they basically confirmed Destiel, at least from Cass's point of view, was another way, okay, we're dead, we're out, here you go. And I think that, I felt like there was a lot of fan service in the last season as well. Here's something you've been wanting. Here's Adam. He's back, right? Certain things that people had been, wanting to see and had been pushing to see. I mean, there was a lot of that, I think, in the last season as well. So, making Chuck, or the writer, the bad guy, and then killing him off at the end. I mean, I suppose from that standpoint, it's kind of a poetic way to end.
Yeah, it didn't seem to me to be consistent with Chuck as he'd been characterized earlier.
And the debate will forever rage. We also had a lot of people who are very religious who were really affronted by the whole thing, to the point where some folks just had to drop the show because they couldn't separate their personal beliefs about the divinity from the show and the character, and really struggled with that. So it's kind of interesting to watch the fan reaction to all of that. And I'm intrigued when you say it's kind of like passing the show off to the fans now, because there was some element of that in Fan Fiction, the musical, where there was a lot of validation of, well, you see it your way, I see it my way, but it wasn't a condemnation. And they may have been originally skeptical of the girls in their play, but in the end, they were both very affirming. And we see Sam and Dean seeing themselves through a new lens. What distance did we cover between that 200th episode and the 327th, in terms of that connection of almost a co-authorship in some ways?
Well, I mean, I think that there's always going to be a certain amount of, I mean, I respect the writers as creators themselves, right? I mean, I think that's what, I write fan fiction myself. Not that I've had time much in the last few years, but I don't have all that extra time that other people have. I don't know how that happened, but whatever. I respect them as writers. I respect them as having their own vision. And I mean, honestly, if it wasn't for their vision, we wouldn't have our vision, right? So I never felt like I needed validation from them, any more than I really felt like they needed validation necessarily from the fans. My own feeling, and I know there's a lot of disagreement over this as well, is that I always have felt like the writers reaching out was an attempt to make a connection, to share that joke, and maybe not understanding the fans' perspective very well at the very beginning, and learning as they went along, which, we've all been new to fandom and had to sort of figure out, how does this work, right? I mean, when you enter any new group, you sort of have to find out what the ground rules are. You have to sort of learn what the people involved, what's important to them, what is funny in the context and what isn't funny in the context. And I think there were maybe some missteps at the beginning, with Monster at the end of this book and not understanding some of the dynamics there. But I think they learned as they went along. And I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, they are writing something for consumption, right? So, I think there's been a lot of change over the last 15 years in how fans interact with things and how the industry sort of reacts to that.
Yeah, and I think that's something that, again, in the article that we co-wrote in the second book, this is something that we talk about, is that the show is, to some extent, sometimes literally raising those questions. What is it that audiences want? Give me what I want, or I'll tear it down, which is kind of Amara, right? She's kind of the fan who wants the universe to be the way she wants the universe to be, and if she's not, then and that's an interesting thing in the context of television, especially. Because to survive, you have to have a significant size audience on television, which means you have to have broad appeal, which means you have to care what fans want. But that's kind of antithetical often to what you might want to do as an artist. And I think that's a tension that we see the show addressing it. I think fan fiction addresses it really interestingly.
Yeah.
You put it in the context of a high school musical, you take a lot of that burden weight away, and you can sort of just ask the question, what is it that the artist is trying to do?
Yeah, Chuck has got to be one of the writers who takes editorial input the worst.
Oh yeah, that was fabulous.
Two times, if you think about him in that mentally constructed bar with Metatron, when Metatron is trying to be so polite, but really this draft sucks. Yeah. And then later on, when he goes to Becky's, and Becky is telling him, this is just awful. You can't do this. And then Chuck gets really upset. What's going on there from your perspective, and how does that tie into the whole meta piece?
Well, that I think is you're spot on. That's, to me, dead interesting, because from one point of view, I won't drop the F-bomb. I'll just say, screw you. That's what the artist can say. This is the story I want to tell. You don't like it? Tough. But I mean, those episodes that, I think one of the things that the last couple of seasons especially is really addressing is the fact this show's been on for 15 years. We have passionate fan base. They have expectations. There is no way to tell a story that's going to satisfy all of those people. What do you do in that context? As an author, do you simply say, screw it, I'm going to write what I want to write and let the chips fall where they may? Do you try to find ways to accommodate what you think the fans want? And I think, we see some examples of that. Lisa mentioned, for instance, the nod to Destiel that comes up near the end. And I think that's one of the things that I think is one of the things that the show was grappling with very self-consciously in the last couple of seasons, is that there is a real tension between what commerce demands, what success demands as a media property, and what you might feel as a writer or a room full of writers is where you want it to go. And it's a struggle and it's a negotiation. And I think to some extent, we see that played out in the last season in the struggle between the author who wants this story. And as you say, people will keep telling the author over and over and over again, this isn't a good story. You shouldn't be telling this story. This isn't the story that we want to hear. But this isn't the story that we want to hear isn't the same thing as this isn't a good story.
Well, and in this case, you have characters who adamantly refuse to follow the script. And a lot of us as authors have started out with a wonderful outline, and we get to chapter 12 and the character just goes in a different direction and there's no bringing them back. And you go, that I like that better. In a way, that's what's happening here with Sam and Dean and Chuck just can't handle it.
Yeah, and that's a great sort of postmodern and meta trope. I'm going to drag in some high culture literature. One of my favorite moments in the novel, The French Lieutenant's Woman, is the beginning of chapter 13, where Fowles breaks the illusion completely. He's ended chapter 12 by saying, "Who is this woman and what is she doing?" He begins chapter 13, "I don't know," he says.
We've all been there.
I had every intention of her to do this at this point in the book, and she didn't. She just did this. And the whole chapter is about that. And that's something that people, I think, tend to think of as that's serious art. You don't get that in pop culture. Well, you really do, and you certainly get it in Supernatural.
One of the other episodes that I noticed warranted an entire chapter in the book was A Very Supernatural Christmas.
Yeah.
One of those favorites. It's a fan favorite, but like Mystery Spot, it's heartbreaking. And I know, Dominick, you brought up Mystery Spot before. Thoughts here on Mystery Spot and A Very Supernatural Christmas?
Well, I mean, A Very Supernatural Christmas is something we usually watch around the holidays.
We do, yeah. It's become a kind of a family tradition.
It has. So yeah, I mean, I really like that one in the different layers of the Sam and Dean's relationship, and how you can actually live with somebody and spend every day with them and still not really be in tune with what they're really going through, right? It's often hard when you're going through trauma yourself to understand the trauma that somebody else is going through. So I really love that one from that standpoint. And I mean, Mystery Spot, very much the same sort of thing. And it's just hilarious. Yeah,
that chapter in the first book, Kevin Wetmore wrote that chapter. It's one of the really, I think, one of the best ones we had. And it's great because, and he's right, it's an episode that simultaneously basically is a Christmas special. It tracks what you expect a Christmas special to have, but also subverts your expectations about a Christmas special. So it's simultaneously a straight Christmas special, but also a commentary on what we expect Christmas specials to be.
All the way down to that dated intro from the 80s.
Yep.
Oh yeah.
That's one of the things he talks about in the chapter, actually, and then the trouble Kripke had getting permission to use it and the whole
I bet
thing. And changing channels, again, I think it's similar, is, it's part of it is just, very sophisticated pastiche, where you can almost, if you're familiar, you can almost immediately identify like which show is
Mhm.
it's not just like a detective show, it's Miami Vice.
No,
Not Miami Vice, Miami, CSI Miami. Yeah,
Miami.
you can tell specifically. It's not just a doctor show; it's Grey's Anatomy.
And Knight Rider.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And so part of it is just that play, but part of it again, I think, is also playing on what those things mean to people.
Mm-hmm.
And to some extent, they mean those things to Dean and Sam. To some extent, they don't. But
and we see why.
Yeah, and we see why. But it's for me, it's one of the strengths of Supernatural is they're often riding this fine line between parody and seriousness.
Well, and it's an interesting nod because given CW's demographic of teenagers,
yeah,
a lot of those cultural references are not what teenagers are going to get. That's a nod to the core fandom, which it tends to be a lot older than teenagers and may bring their own teenagers to the conventions. And I think that's an interesting kind of a respectful nod that says, we see you and we know who a lot of you are, and we know you're going to get this joke, even if your kid who's watching it with you doesn't. Just subversive in a way, given the audience.
It's interesting, and I've always, I think that the CW has had other instances where it's done shows that don't really seem to fit their demographic, but are very good shows. Jane the Virgin, for instance, is another that doesn't seem to be aimed at a teen audience. And I suppose with Supernatural, you put two good-looking young guys in the lead roles. That's what it looks like. It looks like it's a show for teenagers, but it's not just a show with teen appeal. I'm not even sure it's primarily a show with teen appeal, really.
No, it's not.
And then they hang out for 15 years and they're not teenagers anymore.
No, true.
Yeah. But I mean, even at the beginning, it really wasn't. I mean, I was going to conventions early in the run, and I mean, there were no teenagers. I mean, I actually skewed younger as the conventions went along, which was interesting. And then, eventually men would come, and that was like, wow.
Of course, originally, technically, it wasn't CW. It was like
it was the WB, only the first year.
Yeah.
And but I mean, one of the other things I think for me that's fascinating about the relationship is that I think that fans don't necessarily, I mean, again, I think this is something that has grown, but I don't think fans really sort of understand the other side of it and the tensions that are coming down from the writers, from like the production and the studio and the networks. And trust me, those old white guys do not know what's going on in the real world. Okay. Like they have, it's hilarious to go to entertainment law convention or conferences and things and just to hear what's said about audiences. And it's just kind of like, really?
Before we move on to the new book, I wanted to touch on the chapter on Pamela Barnes, because that really surprised me. You're talking about okay. Thoughts on that?
Well, it surprised us in a good way. I don't mean to suggest negatively, but it wouldn't have occurred. I don't think it would have occurred to either of us. Not that having an article on Pamela Barnes wasn't great, but when we were thinking, about meta episodes, we weren't particularly thinking of the Pamela Barnes character. So when we got this proposal about someone talking about Pamela Barnes in relationship to literary history and how she fits into these archetypal roles and how she can be seen as a figure of these different kinds, it really was something. That's the beauty of this sort of project, is you have expectations, but you also have these things that are gifts, basically. And it was actually one of the ones that the referees for the book really liked.
Yep.
So yeah, it was great to see a character who was a kind of a personal favorite of mine actually get that much attention.
I've really been fascinated over the course of doing a lot of these panels for Continual, how many ACA fans we have, academics who are looking at this show in such detail and from so many different angles. And it is fascinating and really instructive to see something that was not built to be dissected by academics hold up so well under the scrutiny and bring so much weight to a genre that isn't generally thought of as weighty. Now we have a new book out, and that is looking at some of the political threads in Supernatural. The last election, Kripke said, I invented Sam and Dean, and I know who they voted for. So it's really never been far from the surface, because all of those elements do have political manifestations. So what made you, I know you said you had an overabundance of raw material, but what sent you in this direction?
Well, the papers, that's actually where we started.
Exactly.
You know, we took a look at the things that we got, because, you know, you put out a call for papers that you're looking for things on, you know, the meta of Supernatural, and then you get inundated with things that are like bang on target what you were thinking you were going to get. And then you get things like the Pamela Barnes that are kind of like, wow, that's cool. And then you get things on, you know, like politics. It was just really interesting that there were so many of them that's, you know, it was sort of a natural grouping. It was actually pretty easy to sort of say, this is the second book, this is the first book. And only first and second insofar as, you know, these are the ones that are really on target to what we were looking for. And these are the ones that are surprisingly so cohesive.
Yeah, we were looking for, because we thought we can't have a book that has all these papers in it. It'd be too big. It would, you know, they wouldn't publish it.
And we loved them all.
Yeah, they were really, really good. And can we come up with a way, you know, a framework that's sufficiently focused that it doesn't just sound like a bunch of essays on Supernatural, but also sufficiently broad that we can slot in what we have. And the idea of, I mean, politics, if you think about it, it's not just, you know, who you vote for. There's sexual politics. There are other kinds of political relationships that you can tie in there, and that's what it's about. It's not just about, you know, Democrat, Republican, or whatever. It's about, you know, body politics. It's about gender politics. It's about the politics of fandom, and pretty much everything that didn't fit in the first book could be slotted in there. And I think we did a second call for papers just to see if we could beat anything else out of the woods. And I'm not even sure we actually got anything else, or whether it was all just papers from the first book.
I'm pretty sure it was just papers from the first book.
Yeah. But yeah, it was, it just works. So we came up with a way of dividing them into, you know, sort of subcategories, like, you know, specifically, what does it mean to be American?
Mm-hmm.
So the first few chapters are people talking about Sam and Dean in the context, you know, in one case explicitly in the context of politics. You know, really good paper that does a sort of a quantitative analysis of what it is that is appealing about Supernatural to people, depending on whether they're in effect liberal leaning or conservative leaning, and, you know, showing how the show again rides this knife edge. It's got plenty of stuff that if you're, you know, a red state kind of person, it's going to appeal to you, but plenty of stuff that if you're a blue state person, it's going to appeal to you. And then the other sections, again, just sort of, you know, other ways of categorizing stuff in terms of different conceptions of the political.
Yeah, you've got two characters rooted in Kansas, which was, of course, at one point bloody Kansas, the geographic center of the country, riding down the back roads. And then you've got topics in your book like American exceptionalism and triumphalism, and looking at consumption and American politics. And you've got things that range from sneaky, like Bobby's pit bull named Rumsfeld, to the entire Leviathan arc and Dick Roman. Yeah. So that's a lot of territory to cover.
Sure. Yeah, and you know, again, I thought we were really, I think one of the things that we found most fascinating was we from the beginning we thought these are good. This is going to be a good book. But when we actually got the proofs and we're like proofing it, we're thinking, yeah, you know,
this really works. These are
really good papers. Yeah. It works really well. That there's a great chapter on the Leviathans and consumerism in this chapter, which in the politics book, which again was one of the for me one of the high points. It was because, you know, it was so spot on, and it hadn't even occurred to me as a way of talking about it. But, yeah.
Well, we have actually blown through our time. I mean, I think we could talk much longer about this because it's really fascinating, and I love how you've gathered so many viewpoints coming and looking at it in some very different, interesting ways. But before we end, please tell us where people can find you online, and do you have other new books coming up? Are you going to write again on Supernatural, or what are you tackling next?
I'm actually doing a lot of work on The Boys at this point. I actually was reading the comic long before it became a Twinkle in Kripke's eyes. But I've been really enjoying what they've been doing with that series. Actually, there's a really interesting entry for one of the characters where the lights are exploding, very Castiel-like. So there are lots of echoes. There's so many Easter eggs as well. I can be found pretty much on all social media as Dean Girl 1. I jumped on that early on, so I got it.
Not quite only have to get Dean Girl, but Dean Girl 1.
Well, yeah. Well,
I'm not on any of the platforms except for Facebook, but there aren't that many Dominick Graces out there. So if you search for Dominick with a K Grace, I'll be the one you find. As for future projects, I'm actually thinking of doing some work on some comics at the moment, because comic book stuff is something that I'm really interested in. I've been, at least I can tell you, I spent like all day today trying to track down a particular graphic novel without much success. But it's hard to say. We've talked about, future projects we could do together. I'm not sure whether we do another book on supernatural, not right away maybe, but certainly there's plenty of room for more there. But one of the things that we're interested in is maybe a book that talks about the different iterations of The Handmaid's Tale that we could collaborate on. That'd be one that we would write as opposed to edit. So there are certainly things percolating, but just getting these put to bed, and especially with things that have been happening over the last year, has been a big enough job in itself. So there isn't anything on the immediate horizon for either of us, anything major on the immediate horizon, like book length, just conference presentations and stuff, right?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Well, there's the dissertation I'm working on, but that's that.
Well, thank you very much for taking time to be with us tonight. And thank all of you for watching and listening. There'll be a lot more Supernatural coming up here on Continual. So we'll see you online.
Thanks so much.